In other words, the federal government wasn't designed to supplicate one state over another. It had to be equal. The uniformity clause is probably the one clause that is violated left and right. A great example of that is when one looks at the bailouts that are granted by President Obama or Bush or Clinton and the first Bush. Federal and corporate welfare are violations of the uniformity clause because it creates a greater burden, but it only benefits one particular state or a couple of states. And the big bailout, TARP bailout, and those types of bailouts that have recently been occurring are really targeted towards big banks or New York City and others, and then they throw a little bit out towards the other states with highway funds or what have you to make you feel good that they're doing something for you, but they're literally robbing us blind, and they are stealing from our future and our posterity. But bottom line, they are violating the uniformity clause, and they cannot do that. They have to be uniform in how they apply the general welfare that they speak of in the Constitution, or that Madison actually goes into great detail on this in the early debates of Congress during the cod fishery bill granting bounties. And this actually happened on February 3rd, and I'm going to read let me get back here. It happened on February 3rd, 1792. So this is the very, very beginning, and Madison is schooling the House of Representatives in Congress because they're looking at this Constitution, and they weren't the privileged ones of being at the Constitutional Convention, and they're just reading into what this general welfare means, and they can do all these great things. And Madison basically gets up and admonishes them and schools them in his speech regarding this cod fishery bill and granting bounties. And it was on February 3rd, 1792. So let me read 5 of the 8 paragraphs. I want to fly through this because I only have so much time. This is Madison speaking. I, sir, have always conceived, I believe those who propose the Constitution conceived, it is still more fully known and more material to observe that those who ratified the Constitution conceived that this is not an indefinite government, deriving its powers from the general terms prefixed to the specified powers, but a limited government tied down to the specified powers which explain and define the general terms. It is to be recollected that the terms common defense and general welfare, as here used, are not novel terms first introduced into this Constitution. They are terms familiar in their construction and well known to the people of America. They are repeatedly found in the old Articles of Confederation, where, although they were susceptible of a great latitude as can be given them by the context here, it was never supposed or pretended that they conveyed any such power as is now assigned them. On the contrary, it is always considered clear and certain that the old Congress was limited to the enumerated powers, and that the enumeration limited and explained the general terms. I asked the gentlemen themselves whether it was supposed or suspected that the old Congress could give away the money of the states to bounties to encourage agriculture, or for any other purpose they pleased. If such a power had been possessed by that body, it would have been much less, or have become very different character from the universally ascribed to it. This, sir, seems to be demonstrable, for if the clause in question really authorizes Congress to do whatever they think fit, provided it be for the general welfare of which they are to judge, and money can be applied to it, Congress must have power to create and support a judiciary, establishment, and a jurisdiction, with a jurisdiction extending to all cases favorable, in their opinion, to the general welfare in the same manner as they. Let me go back. to the general welfare in the manner as they have power to pass laws and apply money, providing in all other way the general or for the general welfare, I shall be reminded perhaps that according to the terms of the Constitution, the judicial power is to extend to certain cases only, not to all cases. But this circumstance can have no effect in the argument, it being presupposed by the gentleman that the specification of certain objects does not limit the import of the general terms. Taking these terms as an abstract and indefinite grant of power, they comprise all the objects of legislative regulators, as well as fall under the Judiciary article in the Constitution, as those falling immediately under the legislative article and the particular enumerations of objects in the legislative article does not, as these gentlemen contend, limit the general power. Neither will it be limited by the Parliament or by the partial enumeration of objects in the Judiciary article. There are consequences, sir, still more extensive, which, as they follow dearly from the doctrine combated, must either be admitted or the doctrine must be given up. If Congress can employ money indefinitely to the general welfare and are the sole and supreme judges of the general welfare, they may take the care of religion into their own hands. They may appoint teachers in every state, county, and parish and pay them out of the public treasury. They may take into their own hands education of the children, establishing in like manner schools throughout the Union. They may assume the provision for the poor. They may undertake regulation of the roads other than post roads. In short, everything from the highest object of state legislation down to the most minute object of police would it be thrown under the power of Congress, for every object I have mentioned would admit of the application of money and might be called, if Congress pleased, provisions for the general welfare. In short, sir, without going further into the subject, which I should not have here touched at all, but for the reasons already mentioned, I venture to declare I declare it as my opinion that were the power of Congress to establish in the latitude contended for, it would subvert the very foundations and transmute the very nature of the limited government established by the people of America, and what inferences might be drawn or what consequences ensue from such a step it is incumbent on all of us to consider. Well, if you go back and read that for yourself, and I know that's kind of hard and it's difficult reading that vernacular or that type of vocabulary and listening to it, but if you go back and read that, clearly he talks about how hard limited the federal government is, and even the judiciary can't listen to all cases, that they're limited to those things that are enumerated within the Constitution. General net welfare was never intended to apply to beyond the enumerated powers and was constrained by the Uniformity Clause, that all dealings with states had to be equally administered or distributed. One could compare conservative entertainers and even these organized Christian leaders as preachers of false doctrines. Sure, they have noble intent and their heart may be in the right spot, but they are fighting to destroy the Constitution and the Republic, and they don't realize it. And this is because they are getting the Republic to turn its back on the Republic and focus on the nation. The progressive agenda has continued to take ground even after decades of conservative talk shows and grassroots organizations. Again, I've mentioned this before, one must read Madison's veto with the remaining, let me get back. I'm tripping myself up. One must read Madison's veto that I talk about several times. It's the 1817 veto of the bonus bill. This is where Madison basically humiliated his fellow congressmen, and I think that's one of the reasons why the father of the Constitution is recognized by a monument called the Library of Congress. In reading this, and I'll be getting to this in a future show, but when you read this veto, he clearly calls out the four mystical clauses and how they have no ability to inject any new roles, responsibilities, or powers, or what I like to call portals for the federal government to assume and usurp powers. Those four mystical clauses are the General Welfare Clause, the Commerce Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, and the Supremacy Clause. And in this veto, when I read it, I'm going to try to do some on-air analysis, but I want to read it in its entirety. And then in a future show, when I read this, I'm going to give you some analysis as to what he's saying here, what he's saying here, so that it all makes sense. So the epiphany occurs that the only way the federal government can assume any new role, responsibility, or power is through the Article 5 process.